Hello, everyone, and welcome to V.A.C. Roundtable number 60. As Michael Crowitz says, it's the end of the week, but it's not the end of the world. So therefore, it's time for a V.A.C. Roundtable. And of course, we have a special one for you tonight. We are very honored and blessed to have Michael and Michelle Aldrich. They are long-standing activists, 6 to 7 decades of doing this. And needless to say, they have a great history that we want to enlighten you about in regards. So with that in mind, thank you very much for joining us. And from here, I'm just going to launch into our first question. And this one is for both of you and each one of you to respond. What initially brought you to cannabis? When did you first hear about it, smoke it? If you can recall that, what was it for you? Start with you, Michael, and then to Michelle.
I first started out in the summer of 1963. I was going to Harvard Summer School, taking a course in English and American contemporary literature. And there I met a lovely young lady named Betty. And we were sitting in Harvard Yard about 8 o'clock on August 6, 1963, almost to the minute. Sitting in Harvard Yard, it was cool and lovely. And she reached in her purse and said, "Have you ever tried this?" And she hauled out a skinny New York joint, really a nail joint. It was very thin. And it was very tasty. I enjoyed the taste right off. It made me cough. And it didn't hurt that an hour later we were in bed together. That's always a good start for a marijuana career. And little did I know that it would last the rest of my life. That was quite an introduction.
Michelle?
Me, it was rock and roll. I moved out of the house, got my first apartment, and somehow ended up at this rock band house. And it was in San Antonio, Texas. And I started smoking marijuana after I watched them for a couple of weeks to make sure. I had majored in nursing. I wanted to make sure what they were doing was okay. You know, I questioned the smoking of the banana peel too.
You remember that?
Yeah, unfortunately.
But that's where I first got introduced from a rock and roll band.
Right on. Well, then I will turn this directly over to Peggy Jones. Councilmember Jones, you have the next question.
Good evening, Mike and Michelle. Thank you so very much for joining us. What brought you into cannabis academically on a path to rediscover our country's rich cannabis hemp history? Thank you.
That's Michael.
I spent a year in India in 1965. And other than that, a few times in 1963, as I mentioned, it was the first time that I had come into a society that was bong-oriented rather than alcohol-oriented. And I've noticed that contrast all my life between a whole country where the most popular drug was cannabis in various forms, versus the United States, which had prohibited it for so long. And academically, I started a research project. I had gotten a contract for a book that was to be about cannabis. And so I decided to write my doctoral dissertation on cannabis at the State University of New York at Buffalo. So I started Sunyab Limar, a Limar organization there, and did write my dissertation on cannabis. And I think it was called Marijuana Myths and Folklore. And I think it was probably the first doctoral dissertation in the United States that had been accepted. I turned it into should I keep going?
Keep going.
I turned it into the English department chairman, a wonderful man named Al Cook, who had been responsible for increasing the faculty at SUNY Buffalo to include people like Leslie Fiedler and Bob Creeley, many other poets and writers. So I turned in 600 pages about marijuana, 600 type double-spaced pages. And he called me in. He said, "What am I supposed to do with this? I mean, how does it relate to English?" And about a week later, he called me in again and he said, "We have an answer." And the answer is that the University of California at Berkeley has just started a folklore department. So the State University of New York at Buffalo now has a folklore department, and your dissertation will be accepted as a folklore dissertation. I was thrilled. It's the first time anywhere in the United States that had been accepted.
Except out of the 600 pages, they only
Oh, right.
accepted like 250.
Right. They wanted me to cut it down, so I based it mostly on the historical part, plus arguing in favor of Lemont.
And that's where he discovered that Washington grew hemp
Right.
and all the original stuff that everybody's based everything off of for years.
And the library at SUNY Buffalo had a lot of travel books. And it turned out that the travel books were where you'd find a mention that this guy went in and smoked some bong or he ate some edibles and describes the trip. So that was very interesting as a start for academia.
Well, one thing that he forgot to mention about India was if you wanted an alcoholic drink, the cab driver would take you behind the auto repair shop to get the alcohol.
One little glass of terrible vodka.
Unless you went to a hotel and then you had to sign a form that's saying, "I am an alcoholic."
Interesting, huh?
But you could buy bong milkshakes at the store.
At any corner store.
So I mean, it was a whole different society of the way to look at it.
It was
And
a cannabis-centric society, which you had probably never experienced before.
Right.
exactly.
So there I drank bong on Shiva tree in Benares and got very, very stoned, wandering around listening to skulls pop. The burning ghats in India are where they burn the bodies. And this was a burning ghat that I went to, and almost everybody at the ghat was stoned. It was a funeral process that was ordinarily accepted. You got stoned. Quite interesting.
That would make things a lot easier for our society. I don't know. Death regardless. That is absolutely fascinating. Thank you for sharing that with us. Next up will be Council Member Michael Crowitz.
Thank you, Etienne. It's so great to have you on the roundtable, Michael and Michelle. It's so good to see you. My question, I just before I ask it, I'll preface it to say that I was giving a speech with Dale Geringer one time at a meeting, and he asked me to give a speech about the early cannabis movement in the U.S. And I thought that was great because most people really have very little knowledge before like 1975 or 74 of what happened, pre that time period. For whatever reasons, but mostly, I guess, because of the commercialization, I guess, of high times and stuff. But anyway, I was trying to figure out, and I didn't really think about it that hard, who was, where did who's the first cannabis activist? And I remember Fred Gardner was very happy with me because I said Louis Armstrong was in my mind the first cannabis. I gave mention to Dr. Woodward, of course, from the AMA back in the 30s, but of course that was his job. He was a lobbyist, and Louis, his day job was, we all know it was a great jazz musician. He didn't have to do marijuana stuff. That wasn't, in his job description. I'm sure it put him at extra risk, even as much risk as he was in. But anyway, I'd love to hear the question is, what do you consider the birth of the cannabis movement? And where does Lemar, kind of, fit in that? And where did Lemar merge into Amorphia? If you give us sort of a sketch of that.
I do like the idea I read in one of the biographies of Louis Armstrong that he refused to go anywhere without cannabis. He had to have a smoke or two before he went on stage every time to play that incredible instrument. And I've lost the thread. Louis Armstrong.
He always had to have some before he went on stage.
Yes, and Mesro told that in Really the Blues, his book. And the thing was, he was so famous that they sent secret security agents with him, as they would with the president or something like that. And these people were responsible for making sure that Louis got his cannabis through customs in any country. I love that story. I love that story. But the real start of Lemar was in 1964, when a young man named Lowell Eggemeyer marched into a police station here in San Francisco and said he didn't think that marijuana should be illegal, and he slapped a joint on the counter and demanded to be arrested. That's an amazing, brave thing for a young kid to do in San Francisco.
And they arrested him.
And of course they arrested him. Eventually went to trial. He spent a year in jail and got out. Dale Geringer, the important part is that his lawyer was a very right-wing attorney named James R. White III. And he characterized himself as more right than Barry Goldwater. And James R. White III wrote legal briefs to defend Eggemeyer. He wrote 4 of them, and they became the Lemar briefs. He called the organization Lemar for legalized marijuana. And those 4 briefs are very rare now. I have all 4 copies somewhere in the box. And that started the Lemar movement. As it happened, Allen Ginsberg and Peter Orlowski were in Berkeley at the time giving a poetry reading. And he heard about this. There was a tiny little article in the newspaper, one of the local newspapers, that Dale Geringer found, describing that the start of this group to legalize marijuana, and that they'd march to City Hall and so forth. And so that was the beginning. When James R. White published those 4 legal briefs, he included references to the Indian Hemp Commission and to the LaGuardia Report and to anything else he could find. He did a really good research job. And that was my first start on actual marijuana historical research. That sent me to various sources that he'd sourced, and it went from there.
And there you have it.
And
Go ahead, Michelle.
Lowell Eggemeyer lives in Sacramento and doesn't want to have anything to do with marijuana or to be interviewed, or he's very quiet. Interesting.
Michael, you had a follow-up?
This is a follow-up. If you could help us see the New York connection, because I know there's a Lemar New York connection, or at least I believe there is.
What happened was Alan heard about Lemar in San Francisco, went back to New York, and talked about it with Ed Sanders. They decided to start a Lemar in New York with a young man named Randy Wicker, who ran a head shop. And so the basis of it was that they advertised in the head shops to get people to try to legalize marijuana. And it worked. They held meetings. several of the people also went to Chicago in the August 1968 hippie revolution. And that's how it started in New York. From there, Ed Sanders was a very famous poet already at the age of what, 20 or something. And he was in touch with John Sinclair. So he sent John Sinclair a bunch of pamphlets that Ed had written about legalizing marijuana. John Sinclair thought they were wonderful. And he appointed a couple of people in the Trans-Love Energies commune in Detroit and Ann Arbor. Joe and Roseanne Mulkey were the leaders of the Detroit Lemar. They came out to visit me at my place in Buffalo, and I went home from school and my door was open, and here's these two bikers sitting in my living room, having gotten in somehow. I don't know how they got in. And so they're sitting there and they announced themselves as being from Detroit Lemar, and they brought a whole bunch of pamphlets that John had published. This gave me the idea to start one in Buffalo.
And
So
thus
the
the
history-
New York connection was born and maintained.
Yep.
Right on. Well, we're gonna shift here a little bit. Council Member Pius, our British brother, you have a question up next. Go ahead, Pius.
Hey, Mike and Michelle, thank you for joining us. Could you share us with your work in the realm with HIV?
Oh, HIV. In 1986, I had 46 friends die of AIDS. Michael and I looked at each other and said, no one's going to help the junkies. The gays have some support, but no one's going to help the junkies,
The
so
needle
we have
users.
to. So we kept thinking about how we go about doing things. So Michael joined,
I chose.
no, before I chose. He joined with Pat Bernanke
Oh, why?
and Harvey
Yes.
Feldman,
Uh-huh.
and they were doing bleach and teach.
Mayor Dianne Feinstein would not let us
Distribute bleach.
distribute needles.
Well, needles.
We
yes.
wanted to have a needle exchange real early because we recognized that we're sharing needles that was spreading HIV. But Dianne Feinstein refused to allow that to happen. So in retaliation, more or less, we discovered that bleach would stop HIV. So we handed out a lot of bleach in little bottles, and people would be given the bleach and they were instructed how to clean their own needles as to not get HIV. And we think that that process, well, it included outreach workers going around. These were ex-convicts, ex-prostitutes, ex-felons, who we trained to go back into their own neighborhoods and work with the gang that they'd come out of, or the prostitutes on a certain street corner, and teach them how to clean their needles with bleach. We think that doing it is what prevented San Francisco from rising 15% a year in HIV positivity,
Like they
Yeah.
did in New York.
like New York had to cope with. In other words, we think that it saves San Francisco needle users from the epidemic by a simple outreach program. My job in that was to train the outreach workers how
Well,
to
no,
go back.
you were at, yes,
No.
and then you went to ICHO.
YES, and we started a training organization at Youth Environment Study with Harvey Feldman and Pat Bernanke. But
Then you went to ICHO.
and then we went to the Institute for Community Health Outreach, which was run by a very famous lesbian named Pat Norman. Pat has her picture painted up on a mural in the Castro now. And Pat started this organization funded by the State Office of AIDS For 12 years, we trained every outreach worker from San Francisco and Oakland and all across the state. We went to San Bernardino, we went to LA, we went all over the place, Fresno even, Auburn up in the north part, and training outreach workers how to deal with their own community with the information that that community needed. It was very successful.
And while Michael was doing that, in 1989, I got a job. I was housing manager of the 6th International AIDS Conference, housing for 12,000, negotiate with 54 hotels, plus access to all the researchers in the world. And so I got to talk to them and explain more about needle exchange. I was doing housing for the CDC people and the NIDA people. And so they came to town to look at the hotels. And while they were doing that, I showed them the needle exchange. And one of the big CDC people's doctors was standing in line, waiting to ask questions. And a junkie looked at him and said, "Excuse me, are you in line?"
For a
He
needle.
he was interested that it was that easy to do all this stuff and to save lives. So I got to spread some of the harm reduction to the people I got to know. Then I went to work as president of AIDS Prevention Action Network. We were a network of 7 needle exchange programs in California, and
Joey Trampy.
Joey Tranquino was part of it. And we did that for a few years, and Joey went off and kept doing it, and I went off to write the medical marijuana laws.
Well,
All because of 46 friends dying in 1 year.
I'm sorry you had to endure that, but thank you for finding the strength to do something about it and not sit back and watch it. You saved countless lives, friends that I know and people that I would come to know and love, and I'm not sure they would have had that chance if you wouldn't have been there doing what you did. So I personally thank you, and I think society owes y'all a debt of gratitude and thanks for not sitting by, getting active and doing something about it, which unfortunately so many people do.
We're not that type of people. We can't sit by and, I open mouth, insert leg. I stopped with the foot years ago. You have to do something about it. You have to change it. It doesn't have to be this way. The one out of all of the AIDS stuff, we were one of the first straight couples that had our friend. He was living in a gay hotel downtown San Francisco and cleaned houses. And Dianne Feinstein made it a homeless hotel. So he made all the gay guys homeless. And so Dennis came to stay with us in the end of September. And by Christmas, he was almost dead. AZT hadn't been approved yet. He was a veteran. So the first week of January, we took him to the Veterans Hospital, and that's where he died. So it was very personal to us. We had to do something.
At that time, it was so early in the HIV epidemic that they put a sign on the door of his room saying HIV.
Do not enter.
Right.
And that was on a lot of veterans doors that we tried to go say hi to all of them.
And the only thing they had to offer was AZT, which became legal the day he died. If
Yep.
I remember right.
Exactly.
Hmm.
They finally approved it.
That had to be absolutely bitter to
Yeah.
experience. I'm sorry, but thank
I
you.
think that's the way that marijuana spreads between people. A friend turns on a friend, turns on a friend, and pretty soon you have 50,000 people smoking weed.
That's the thing that I have found is that cannabis crosses every socio-economic barrier.
Yes.
And it's one of the very few things that I've found that can do so besides oxygen and food.
Those are a couple of essential items.
In that order.
Touche. All right. Well, humbling story to say the least, but thank you for your actions again. Next up will be Mary Lynn Mathry.
Hi, Marilyn.
Councilmember Mathry.
Hi, guys. Thanks. Yeah, as you're saying that, I'm thinking, May and Arnold Nutt, their son died the day that it became legal in Michigan.
Donnie
Mhm.
McNutt.
Yeah. Grandma marijuana in Michigan. May not. All right. We're going to still go back in time here. In an effort to give recognition to those who made great sacrifices to legalize cannabis during the critical and challenging days before 1972, that created the foundation for our modern cannabis movement, including academics and historians like the Fitzhugh Ludlow Library, who should we remember and recognize?
Well, I made a list. Besides Lowell Lakemeyer. Alfred Lindesmith,
Very famous sociologist.
Yep.
Allen Ginsberg. Allen went to Lindy's place and got all his stuff. So that's how Allen got his marijuana collection. And Michael was Allen's secretary in '69 and got access to all of Allen's stuff. Of course, Lester Grinspoon.
Whose sons are now involved.
Well, Peter, definitely. You had Peter on recently.
Yes.
Todd Micarea.
Bless Todd. Show the book.
Oh, yes. Todd's book, Marijuana Medical Papers, 1839 to 1972. Norm Zimberg. He developed set and setting. Andy Weil, of course.
Well-
Ed Sanders.
Wait, since you mentioned Andy and Norm, there was a third person involved in their 1968 article, which is one of the best early articles. Weil, Zinberg, and Nelson. It was Judith Nelson was the other person. And it was called Clinical and Psychological Effects of Marijuana, spelled with an H, in Man. It was in Science Magazine, December 13th, 1968. It was the first article that showed that you could do marijuana research with human beings, not just rats and not just rabbits, but with actual human beings. They showed it was safe to do that research. That, my friends, was the start of the entire academic movement of modern times.
Ed Sanders, who helped Michael with the marijuana review and was with Allen Ginsberg. John Sinclair and Richard Evans Schultes, who did the 3 species defense. And that's sort of my list.
Anyone else off the top of your head? Of course, we know the known knowns, but if there's any unknowns that you feel are we don't want any left out. We're trying to learn, but that sounds like a very comprehensive breakdown you all about.
I can't think of anybody else.
Councilmember Jones, you had a follow-up?
I have a question. You were talking about the research with cannabis and mammals, specifically rats. With the knowledge you have on mammals, other than humans, would you agree that they also have endocannabinoid receptors and that us eradicating cannabis from the wild was a negative thing and causing issues with our wildlife now, since we eradicated it?
With that, I agree with your statement.
Thank you. I've seen it affect not just the wildlife, but the ecosystems, and I'm looking for proof. Thank you.
Yeah, good. I like your shirt too, Voice of Tibet. My sister Judy went to Tibet a few years ago and brought back wonderful things.
Right on. Well, next up will be Councilmember Green. Councilmember Green, you're recognized.
Am I clear? I know I have some volume problems.
We're still having some issues hearing you.
Move close. No, that doesn't help.
No, that doesn't help either.
It's weird.
No. Okay.
Nothing.
Sorry, Michael.
Sorry, Michael Green. Well, I will ask the question then. When did your focus shift to medical? Or was this always a focus to a varying degree, even in the early days? Is medical
hear me
in
now?
some ways in opposition to
Hello?
recreational, or as we call it today, adult regulated access?
Go for that.
Wow. Okay. Because of Michael, I knew about the Indian Hemp Drug Commission. Because of Todd, I knew more. Because of Bob Russell and Alex,
Technology. Is this better?
a lot of people,
Yeah, yeah.
Barbara and Kenny Jenks and LV and
I might be back. Am I heard? Hello?
Michael, we asked the question. They're answering the question, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
so I don't know. I guess, I mean, I always sort of knew it did, but you know, until I had cancer and I healed it in 3.5 months with cannabis oil, I didn't believe it really worked, but it does. Michael,
The question was, repeat the question.
medical.
When did your focus shift to medical, or was this always a focus for you in the to a varying degree, especially in the earlier days?
Had to be a focus. Because if you write the history of cannabis, a lot of that is the medical uses of cannabis. Starting in 1500 BC, maybe with the Atharva Veda, which recommends balm for relief from distress. It goes back that far. And I want to quote Dennis Perron, who once famously said in Time magazine, all use is medical. And I understand that very well. It doesn't make any difference what your intention is, whether you just want to get stoned or not. That use is medical. It will help any of the health conditions that it helps. And you may not even realize it until you suddenly realize you're breathing better or you're feeling better in general. So my answer is the medical and recreational use are indistinguishable in history, and the modern distinction ignores the fact that even recreational use is medical use.
Now, the one thing that's going to come up is the rescheduling because of this.
Right.
If we reschedule to Schedule 3, that's medical only. So what will happen to recreational? It's going to be a good, interesting question to pose if the DEA even goes along with it. I think personally that the whole schedule should have been thrown out because we have mushrooms and stuff in Schedule 1 too.
Makes no sense.
And you know, none of and benzodiazepines in 4. None of it makes any sense. It isn't scientific. It should be thrown out. And if they want to redo it, start it from scratch. But this is unacceptable.
Well, as I've told people, we did all this under Schedule 1, Schedule 2 or 3 won't change anything for us to a certain resolve. It'll just cause people to go back to being activists as opposed to sitting back and being proprietors, I think. Um, with that in mind, we'll try Michael Green for the next question, which is his question. Michael Green, you want to try for number 7?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I'll be damned, excuse me. Michael, Michelle, it is a genuine pleasure to see you. I'm fascinated a little bit before I go on to the next question. In your reading in the Vedas, it's my understanding that Shiva is the Lord of cannabis, the Lord of yoga, the Lord of the dance, that the art of Veda as is one of the sacred plants. Where else in your early studies did that kind of manifest? And then I will go on to my question, because you've given us now a 3,500, maybe 5,000 year history, because obviously this information existed prior to the Vedas.
As you probably know, ancient China had a lot of involvement with hemp, and it wasn't just for cloth and thread. They grew a lot of hemp in China. I don't remember the exact places, but they keep discovering little stashes of hemp in burial tombs, and
Like the Scythians.
like the Scythians, who crossed Central Asia and brought cannabis with them everywhere they went. They were the best horsemen in the ancient world,
Yes.
and they'd ride into a place and conquer it. And part of their society, part of their zeitgeist, if you will, was cannabis being spread all through the Middle East. Chris Bennett has done a wonderful job of recounting some of that early history.
Excellent, thank you for that. Just, it seems to me like history is telling us this has been medicine from time immemorial. So the follow-up, the question I've been assigned and now posed is, it's my understanding that you look in retirement, where you are at the moment, especially you, Michelle, are looking to create a cannabis museum. We're just curious what your vision is, what that would encompass, what you need to get that together, and maybe perhaps what we can do to assist you in that.
This has been a dream of ours for a very long time. Even at home and in my 2 storage places, I have like 500 boxes of cannabis materials. Many books, many of them autographed, a whole library of cannabis stuff at home and in a couple of storage areas up north. And I don't know what to do with them. So the best part for me would be to create a museum that was bigger than a museum. And Michelle will talk about that. This is basically her idea, and it's a really good one.
Well, what I want to do is do a California Cannabis Historical Society. Let me read you a definition. A historical society, also known as a preservation society, is an organization dedicated to preserving, collecting, researching, and interpreting historical information and items. Besides a museum on top of that would be perfect for what we want. California Normal has all their archives. Chris and Mickey, Jack Harrer, Jeannie has all of Jack's. We all need someplace to put them, and we're getting older and older and older. So I always had the dream that all the dispensaries at one point, when everything was legal, would all want to give money to a museum, a historical society, to keep it all, because we were the first ones to put marijuana on the ballot. Did you know that the hemp was grown at Sutter's Mill before they discovered gold? The first
Richardson.
building in San Francisco was made out of Richardson's sale, which means the first building in San Francisco was made out of marijuana. There is history in California of, besides the marijuana issue, all the hemp issue. And it should be told to people. And if we're running at the California State Fair, judging different types of marijuana, they have historical societies to other crops. Then I thought of Prop 64. Prop 64 basically gave money to the cops for a few years. That I think has finally expired. They're giving money for 10 years to research facilities. And after that, they have all the money for themselves. So why not have a law that says, I want to give $5 million to a cannabis historical society? And so we can buy a building and put it all together.
In Northern California.
And we do it in San Francisco. That's where I always wanted it to be. And we have to make sure it's not near water, that it's high enough, that it's not near fire. And so I think I've gotten a legislator to sponsor the legislation. And so now all I have to do is start putting the 501c3 together and a board and articles of incorporation and all that wonderful stuff that the
So we
federal
need
government
lawyers.
requires. So it'll come, but we're getting too old. We have to do something with it, and we don't want it to just. We don't have kids. We had a library. What can I say?
What a wonderful notion. Thank you so very much for sharing everything you've shared this evening, and I look forward to being able to visit.
Good. Thank you.
the
Love to
Marijuana
see you.
Historical Society in California.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that, Michael. Next up will be Peggy Jones again, Councilmember Jones.
I have one final question. On my healing journey, I did a lot of research on herbs and what most would consider common weeds. And I found that they're using a lot of pharmaceuticals, yet we're told in ads daily, here, you need to kill your weeds with this weed killer and that weed killer. With that being in our face all the time, would you say that that contributes to our problem with getting this legalized? Because they are constantly programming people that the term weeds is bad. Thus, I hear people all this time, oh, you smoke weed. There's an association there. Would you say that this negative propaganda for common weeds that are also medicinal to be killed would be also reinforcing that marijuana or cannabis should not be legalized? And that's impeding our journey to get this recreational or medicinal marijuana nationwide. Thank you.
Personally, I don't. I think the people that smoke marijuana know the difference between a weed and a weed. You know, they even on television the other day, I was watching Channel 4 News, and they referred to it as weed. And then they mentioned it was marijuana, and then they mentioned it was cannabis. You know, all in the same story. And it was like, you know, it's the media is just so used to, that's what we used to call it. We used to call it weed, you know, and we knew the difference.
And the other half of that is that the pharmaceutical companies want to make a lot of money on cannabis derivatives. They've already taken over Marinol, which never did work very well. And anything that their scientists can discover or invent is just going to be patented, and it will belong to them. And what happens to the little marijuana farmer up in Ukiah or in Petaluma?
But the pharmaceutical companies have to understand that we have an endocannabinoid system, and they haven't done that yet. And neither has the medical field. Until they understand that we have an cannabinoid system that can be manipulated or medicated with a cannabinoid for a specific purpose,
And then
they aren't going to invest money in it. Not yet.
And another problem related to that, of course, is that doctors don't know anything about medical marijuana use, by and large. A few doctors do. So what Mary Lynn has done for decades is to go talk to doctors groups and nurses groups and talk about cannabis so that they become educated. And until most doctors know more than they do now about cannabis, it's not going to work very well to have the doctors regulating it.
They don't even know what to recommend.
And that's why, yeah, we've hosted a nurse who's actually working on educating other doctors and nurses by attacking that curriculum so that they become educated. So there's hope out there. Realize that, you know, that there's been chances taken by others and who have seen the folly and the misses and are looking to take it up in places. So take heart there at least. We kind of had a question behind the scenes since Michael, you and Michelle, you both have such a history and also a knowledge around nomenclature. We of course know that the terminology weed was, I mean, we know there was a connotation in the 30s as the quote unquote yellow journalism was used to slander cannabis. Do you potentially know the original origin of when weed and cannabis were put together? I do know that history's sake that Helen Moorhead was the one that put hemp and marijuana together. She was a secretary for Anslinger. So she was the one who put two to two together and told him, and of course he took the credit for it. So I always love to demonize Helen Moorhead for her work there in putting them together. But do you have any understanding about when the terminology weed with cannabis was associated?
It'd be late 60s with the hippies, I think. I don't remember any. I'm trying to remember Walton in 1938, Marijuana, America's New Drug Menace, which was surprisingly a very good history of cannabis, even right in the middle of the Marijuana Tax Act. But I don't recall weed being used that early. So my guess would be 1965, perhaps.
What about when the marijuana assassin of youth and the devil weed? Wasn't there, is there a connotation there?
Yes. I have a book called The Dope Chronicles, which collected newspaper articles about marijuana and all kinds of other drugs. And I think Devil's Weed was a 1930s movie. And so maybe that's where it came from.
Okay. Michael Green has his hand up.
I was just gonna say, I recall having come across the Devil's Weed movie and understanding that the terminology as I always understood it, perhaps came back to being after the 37 Act, when of course World War II came into being and suddenly they had to have hemp. And a lot of that after the war became what we called in Arizona ditchweed.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, you know, eponymous. It was everywhere across the country. So in my circles, we always thought related back to those plants that had basically gone wild or back to being wild, just popped up wherever you can find it.
I have a picture of some farmers who were working for Park Davis and Company. I forget where it was. It was in Michigan, I think. They had a big hemp farm, a big marijuana farm. And that was to be able to make their own products from marijuana rather than relying on India as the source.
Interesting. Councilmember Mathry, you've got a question.
I was just gonna comment as well on the weed thing. Found it curious when we were checking with North Dakota. Gosh, couple decades back, but they had passed before the federal hemp bill came about. North Dakota was going to allow farmers to grow it. We were trying to convince somebody to do it. But in calling the governor's office, they referred us to the Department of Noxious Weeds. And it's something to talk about cannabis.
Huh.
Noxious weeds. That sounds about right. Well, that's our questions. I cannot thank you all enough for joining us tonight, and answering our questions. It's been a wonderful talk and discussion. Is there anything else that y'all are working on that you would like to talk about or plug, or is there a future museum location that people are considering, or?
Just San Francisco. I haven't got that far yet. It's all still in my head and I'm slowly talking about it.
One thing I'd like to do is really praise Mary Lynn and Patients Out of Time. For decades, they've been one of the most important people educating other medical people. And I think that that's had a really good effect. And I think that that will be under consideration for medical schools to start teaching courses in cannabis. I hope that's the way it goes. The other part is the little farmer, the small marijuana grower who maybe has a couple of big fields, and even up to the people who have huge warehouses and greenhouses full of cannabis. Don't forget that this is the livelihood for a lot of people in Northern California who are not the big industrial corporations taking over the industry. So I would say it would be important for future laws to make sure that the small cannabis businesses and farms are not just wiped out by the big industrial companies.
Testify.
We have been.
You have, and I cannot thank you enough for your leadership over the decades and guiding us as we've done what we've done.
No, I
Berkeley,
didn't say the most important thing I should have said. Can you guess what it is? I
Go
met
ahead.
my wife at the first National Normal Conference in Washington, D.C. in 1972. That's a 50th anniversary of being together. I invited her to come out to San Francisco. She did 2 weeks later, showed up in this beautiful little yellow Fiat Spider, with a sports car that I dearly love. We've been together for 50 years.
51.
In the same apartment for 50 years.
51 years on Monday.
A cramped apartment.
Yeah.
Our own personal museum, yes.
Truly.
Well, congratulations, and we wish you all a happy anniversary upcoming as you celebrate your wonderful time together. And thank you for this time together with us. I would like to thank Michael Green, Michael Crowitz, Peggy Jones, Mary Lynn Mathry, Mike Davis, Pius, and of course, Nate Landau was here. I'm Etienne Fontan. And of course, thank you, Michael and Michelle Aldrich, for a absolutely wonderful discussion tonight. And we'll be back in 2 weeks, people, for V.A.C. Roundtable number 61.
Thank you.
very much.
It's been our pleasure.